16 men went into the first junction. I counted them. That was my function at the time. Counting, recording, archiving the movements of clearance squads through the tunnel systems beneath Hive Praxis. 16 men descended at 0400. 11 returned. The other 5 remained at the junction, though not in any condition that warranted retrieval. I logged their designations as terminated. The system accepted my input without a query. This was standard. I was born in a forge world whose designation I no longer have clearance to access. The name exists in an archive somewhere, corrupted by time and repeated data migration, but I remember the heat, constant heat. Not the dry heat of desert worlds or the clean heat of plasma vents. The wet, oppressive heat of industrial condensation mixed with human habitation. 37 degrees baseline in the workers' quarters, 41 near the fabrication lines. You learned to sleep in it, or you didn't sleep. I learned. My father worked at the Promethium refineries. I know this because the burn patterns on his hands were consistent with chemical exposure over extended periods. He came home. We had what they called home then, a compartment with 3 bunks and a reclamation unit. And he would sit for exactly 1 hour before the next shift. He never spoke about the work. I don't think they permitted it. Or perhaps he had nothing to say. The refineries processed. He was part of the processing. You don't narrate your function, you perform it. I was 14 standard when the conscription assessors arrived. They tested manual dexterity, cognitive processing speed, obedience response time. I scored in acceptable ranges across all categories. They took 40 of us from that district. I remember the number because I counted them as we boarded the transport. 40 boys between 13 and 16. I was the 23rd to board. The transport lifted at dawn, and I watched the forged stacks recede through the viewport until atmospheric haze obscured them completely. I never returned. The thought of return never occurred to me as relevant. The Munitorum training facility was underground. They told us this was preparation. Most Imperial warfare occurs in environments where you cannot see the sky. Ship corridors, hive under cities, trench systems, cave networks. The humanized dependence on natural light is a liability. They would correct this liability. We descended into the training complex and did not see the open sky again for 2 years. The first month focused on darkness adaptation. They would seal us in chambers with 0 ambient light and gradually introduce tasks. Disassemble your laser gun. Reassemble it. Check your neighbor's assembly. Report defects, all in absolute darkness. Your fingers learn to read the weapon's components like data inputs. The weight of each piece. The texture. The way the power cell is seated with a specific click if aligned correctly. Sound became measurement. You learn to hear the difference between proper assembly and deviation. Failure to identify defects resulted in correction. The corrections were not pleasant, but they were effective. I did not fail often. By the 3rd month, they introduced us to the specialized equipment. Shotguns, short-barrel pattern designed for confined spaces, firing solid slugs or flechette loads depending on target composition. Effective range, 20 meters maximum, optimal at 7 to 12. Beyond 20 meters, the spread pattern rendered the weapon ineffective against armored targets. This limitation was acceptable because subterranean engagement ranges rarely exceeded 15 meters. If you could see a target beyond 20 meters in a tunnel system, You were in an anomalously large space and should request support assets immediately. The flamethrowers were heavier, 41 kilograms, fully loaded with promethium tanks. The fuel burned at temperatures sufficient to compromise most organic matter within 3 to 4 seconds of direct exposure. The weapon's stream reached approximately 12 meters under optimal conditions. Underground conditions were never optimal. Air pressure variations, moisture levels, tunnel geometry, all factors affected performance. You learned to account for these variables in real time, or you wasted fuel. Wasting fuel was a capital offense in some regiments. In ours, it resulted in reassignment to forward positions. Forward positions in clearance operations had a life expectancy measured in hours. They taught us to read the scanners during month 5. Sonar mapping units, motion trackers, thermal imaging when conditions permitted. The sonar was primary. It painted the tunnel geometry in your visor display. Walls, floors, ceiling contours, branching passages. Moving targets appeared as displacement signatures. You learned to distinguish between human movement patterns, equipment vibration, and other sources of motion. The other sources were what we trained to kill. I met Davros during sonar training. He was assigned to my squad for the practical exercises. 6-man teams navigating unmapped tunnel sections beneath the facility. The tunnels were real. Abandoned mining works from whatever extraction operation had preceded the Munitorum's occupation of this site. They were unstable, partially collapsed in sections, and infested with local vermin that the instructors assured us were ideal training proxies for various xeno-species we would encounter in actual operations. Davros was shorter than standard, maybe 165 centimeters, but he moved through the tunnels faster than anyone in our cohort. He had grown up in a hive-under city. He mentioned this once, without elaboration, and the darkness didn't seem to affect him the way it affected the rest of us. We were adapting. He was already adapted. I observed him navigating a collapsed section during our 4th exercise, crawling through a gap perhaps 40 centimeters high, weapon held forward, scanner in one hand. He didn't hesitate, didn't pause to assess. He simply moved as if the tunnel geometry was known data, as if he'd already calculated the optimal path before entering. I asked him afterward how he moved so quickly without checking the scanner constantly. He looked at me. We were in the barracks by then, cleaning equipment, and said the scanner told you what was there. Your body told you what the space wanted you to do. You listened to both. The scanner was data. Your body was also data, older and faster. I didn't fully understand this at the time, but I archived the statement. It became relevant later. Month 7 introduced live-fire exercises against biological targets. They used various species. I don't know where the Munitorum sourced them, and I did not ask. Asking was discouraged. The targets were released into sealed tunnel sections. Our squads entered from designated breach points and eliminated all detected movement. Rules of engagement were simple. If it moves and is not broadcasting an Imperial identification signature, you burn it or shoot it until it stops moving. Confirmation of termination required visual verification when possible. Scanner confirmation when visual verification was unavailable. The first live target I killed was approximately 1 meter in length, 6-limbed, possessed of mandibles that could sever human fingers with minimal effort. The instructors called them tunnel runners. They moved faster than human baseline. The sonar painted them as rapid displacement signatures along walls and ceilings. Standard doctrine was flamethrower saturation. Fill the tunnel section with burning promethium. Deny the target any surface that wasn't aflame. I deployed my weapon as trained. The target ignited, fell, continued moving for approximately 4 seconds, then ceased. I confirmed termination visually. Logged the kill. The system accepted my report. I felt nothing particular about this. It had been a training exercise. The target had been released specifically to be killed. I had performed the required function. Davros confirmed 3 kills in the same exercise. Marcus, another squad member, confirmed 2. We cleaned our weapons, submitted our after-action reports, and returned to the barracks. The instructors reviewed our performance metrics and made notes in whatever systems they used to evaluate our development. By month 10, the exercises became more complex. Multiple target types, branching tunnel networks with no mapped exits, scenarios where scanner data was deliberately jammed or corrupted. They were preparing us for operational conditions where information would be incomplete and time would not permit methodical analysis. You moved, you cleared, you advanced, or you died. The squads that hesitated suffered higher casualty rates during the exercises. Not actual casualties. The instructors terminated the exercise when vital signs indicated critical injury. But the metrics were logged, and those squads received additional corrective training. Our squad's survival rate was 92% across all exercises. This was above cohort average. Davros was the primary contributing factor, though I do not think he understood this as exceptional. He simply moved correctly. When the scanner showed tunnel branches, he selected the correct branch. When motion signatures appeared, he positioned himself in locations that provided optimal firing angles. When equipment malfunctioned, he adapted without requiring instruction. The rest of us learned to follow his movement patterns. I observed that when Davros shifted position, there was usually a reason. The reason became apparent within seconds. A target emerging from a side passage, a structural collapse, a thermal signature indicating environmental hazard. I asked him once if he planned his movements or simply reacted. He said planning was too slow. You looked at the data, and your body moved before your thoughts finished processing. Thinking was for after the engagement, when you had time. During the engagement, you simply acted. I archived this also. Month 14, we received our assignments. Clearance operations, Hive Praxis, Subsector Noctis. The Hive had been declared compliant 40 years prior, but the underhive and substructure had never been fully pacified. Recent seismic surveys indicated extensive tunnel networks beneath the hive's lowest inhabited levels. Motion signatures detected. Command designated this a contamination risk requiring immediate resolution. Clearance operations would commence upon our arrival. We boarded the troop transport 3 days later. 260 personnel, 12 clearance squads, support staff, command element, medical contingent. I sat near the viewport during the initial burn, watching the training facility recede. I remember thinking that I had spent 2 years underground, preparing to spend more time underground. The logic was sound. Specialization required focused training environments. I was now a specialist. The journey lasted 3 weeks. Warp transit compressed the objective duration to something unmeasurable by standard chronology. I did not enjoy warp transit. The ship's interior felt wrong in ways I could not articulate through proper terminology. Sounds occurred without identifiable sources. Distances seemed inconsistent. A corridor you walked in 30 seconds one day required 45 the next. Darvis mentioned once that he smelled burning metal in sections of the ship where no forge or industrial equipment was present. I confirmed the same olfactory data but had no explanation. The ship's crew acted as if these phenomena were routine. Perhaps they were. We made translation into real space at the system's edge. Hive Praxis occupied the third planet, a world whose atmosphere had been declared breathable with minor augmentation. The hive itself was visible from orbit, a massive structure covering approximately 1,200 square kilometers of surface area, rising 6 kilometers above ground level at its highest spires. The underhive extended downward an estimated 4 kilometers. Below that, the substructure. Below that, the tunnels we had been sent to clear. Deployment was efficient. Bulk landers delivered us directly to the hive's lower industrial sectors. We disembarked into processing stations that smelled of recycled air, machine oil, and human waste in concentrations that suggested the recycling systems were operating at maximum capacity. The hive's population density in the lower sectors was 62,000 per square kilometer, according to the briefing data. I observed this density as we moved through the deployment corridors. Bodies pressed against barriers, watching us pass. Faces I did not examine closely. They were not relevant to the operation. Command established our base of operations 7 levels below the lowest habitation zone. The space had been an industrial facility of some kind, enormous chambers supported by columns wider than a chimera transport. The air was cold, 14 degrees. Our breath condensed visibly. I noted this because it was the first time in 2 years I had been in an environment cold enough to see my own respiration. The contrast with the Forge World heat of my childhood registered as significant data, though I could not specify why. The briefing occurred 6 hours after deployment. The commanding officer, a major whose name I logged but have since archived to inaccessible storage, displayed the preliminary survey data on a hololithic projector. The tunnel networks extended beneath our position in 3-dimensional complexity that the projection could barely represent. Hundreds of kilometers of passages, chambers, vertical shafts. Some tunnels were clearly artificial. Mining operations, ancient infrastructure, subterranean transit systems from the hive's construction era. Others were not artificial. The geological surveys indicated natural cave formation, expanded and modified by unknown processes. The motion signatures were concentrated in the lower network sections. Thermal imaging was inconclusive. The target's body temperature approximated ambient conditions. Sonar provided better data. The targets moved in coordinated patterns, suggesting organized behavior rather than simple animal activity. Size estimates ranged from 1 to 3 meters in length. Limb configuration unknown. Combat capabilities unknown. Rules of engagement: eliminate all contacts, map and secure all tunnel sections, establish forward monitoring stations to prevent recontamination. Expected operation duration 6 to 8 months. Expected casualty rate 40 to 60%. We were the 3rd clearance force deployed to this hive. The previous 2 had achieved incomplete results before being redeployed to other operations. Command did not specify what incomplete results meant in practical terms. I assumed it meant they had not eliminated all targets before their deployment window closed. First insertion occurred at 0600 the following morning. Davros was assigned to my squad, also Marcus, who I mentioned before, also Terek, Johan, and Lasker. 6-man clearance team, standard configuration, 2 flamethrower specialists, Terek and Johan, 4 shotgun specialists, myself, Davros, Marcus, Lasker. One of us carried the scanner pack. We rotated this duty daily. The pack added 8 kilograms to your load and required one hand to operate, reducing your weapon readiness. Nobody preferred scanner duty, but the squad could not function without it. The entry point was a collapsed maintenance shaft that engineers had cleared 2 days prior. We descended on cable rigs, one at a time, scanning during the descent. The shaft dropped 40 meters into a junction chamber approximately 20 meters in diameter. 3 tunnel branches led from the chamber at floor level. One led upward at a 40-degree angle. The walls were stone, not Hive-standard construction material. We had descended below the artificial structure into the natural geology. The temperature was 18 degrees, higher than the base level. I noted this discrepancy. The scanner showed no immediate motion signatures, but thermal imaging detected heat sources deeper in the tunnel network. Distance to heat sources: 200 meters minimum, precise ranging impossible due to tunnel geometry interference. Davros took point. This became standard procedure. He moved into the central tunnel branch without waiting for instruction. The rest of us followed at 3-meter intervals. The tunnel was narrow, perhaps 2.5 meters wide, 2 meters high. Ceiling clearance was sufficient to stand upright, but not to raise your weapon above shoulder height comfortably. Flamethrower operation in this geometry would be optimal. Shotgun operation acceptable. Anything requiring vertical aim adjustment would be compromised. We advanced 50 meters. The tunnel curved gradually leftward. The walls showed tool marks in some sections. This had been excavated deliberately at some point. Other sections appeared natural, with irregular stone surfaces that created acoustic distortions. The sonar painted the geometry accurately, but could not account for sound reflection patterns. Every footstep echoed strangely. Davros moved more quietly than the rest of us. I don't know how he achieved this. We wore the same boots, carried similar equipment loads. He simply placed his feet differently. At 100 meters, the tunnel branched again. 3 directions. Davros paused, checked the scanner Marcus was carrying. Motion signature detected in the left branch. Distance, 40 meters. Single contact, moving slowly, perpendicular to our axis of approach. Davros signaled. Standard engagement protocol. Terek moved forward with the flamethrower. Davros and I took flanking positions. Marcus maintained scanner observation. John and Lasker covered our rear. Nothing could approach from behind without being detected, but doctrine required rear security at all times. We advanced into the left branch. The tunnel narrowed further, 2 meters wide, 1.8 high. Davros had to duck slightly. I'm taller. I had to maintain a crouched stance, uncomfortable but manageable. The motion signature was now 30 meters ahead. Still moving slowly. The scanner's resolution wasn't sufficient to determine the target's precise nature, but the movement pattern suggested something large, dragging across the tunnel floor. At 20 meters, Davros stopped. Raised his fist. We halted. He pointed to his eyes. then forward. He had visual contact. I adjusted my position to see past him. The tunnel ahead was dark. Our lumen units provided the only illumination, and their range was limited by design. Too much light compromises your darkness adaptation. But on the edge of the lumen field I saw it. The target was perhaps 2 meters in length, low to the ground, supported by multiple limbs. I counted 6, maybe 8, difficult to determine because it was partially obscured by tunnel geometry. Its surface was ridged, segmented, dark coloration that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The head region, I'm calling it that though it may not have been a true head, was wider than the body, equipped with appendages that moved independently of the limbs. Mandibles, possibly, or sensory organs. It had not detected us yet. It was moving toward a side passage we couldn't see from our position. Davros signaled Terek forward. Flamethrower engagement at this range was suboptimal, too far for guaranteed saturation, but closing distance risked alerting the target. Terek raised the weapon, adjusted the pressure regulator. Davros counted down on his fingers. 3, 2, 1. The promethium stream filled the tunnel. The sound was immense in the confined space, a roaring hiss that drowned out everything else. The fire reached the target within 2 seconds. It ignited immediately. The tunnel filled with light, heat, smoke. The target made a sound, high-pitched, oscillating, wrong. It moved fast, faster than the briefing data had suggested possible. It came directly toward us, burning, still making that sound. Davros fired. The shotgun's report was almost inaudible under the flamethrower's roar and the target's screaming. I fired. Marcus fired. The target was perhaps 5 meters away when it stopped moving. The fire continued to consume it for another 6 seconds. Then Terek released the trigger. The flames died. The tunnel was full of smoke and the smell of burned organic matter and something else. Something chemical that I couldn't identify. We waited 30 seconds for the smoke to clear partially. Davros approached the target's remains. I followed. The corpse, I'm using that word because I lack better terminology, was still smoldering. The body structure was clearer now. 8 limbs confirmed. The head region had been armored with some kind of chitinous plating that had cracked under thermal stress. Internal fluids had boiled and vented through the cracks. The mandibles had seized in an open position. Davros examined it without speaking. Then he looked at me and said it was smaller than expected. I agreed. Command size estimates had suggested targets up to 3 meters. This specimen was 2 meters maximum. Perhaps juvenile. Perhaps the larger ones were deeper in the network. We logged the kill, took visual documentation, and continued the sweep. Standard procedure dictated clearing the entire tunnel section before returning to base. We had 4 more hours of operational time before our air supply required replenishment. We found 6 more targets that day. 4 were similar to the first. Same basic morphology. Size variations between 1.5 and 2.3 meters. 2 were different. Smaller, faster, less armored, but more aggressive. They attacked immediately upon detecting us. One managed to close to within 2 meters before Davros put 3 slugs into its center mass. It continued moving for another 1.5 seconds. Its mandibles were locked onto his boot when it finally ceased function. He had to pry them open manually. The chitinous material was strong enough that it had penetrated the boot's outer layer. He did not report injury, but I observed him adjusting his gait slightly for the remainder of the operation. We returned to base at 1400, debriefed, cleaned equipment, ate, slept. The following day we descended again. Different entry point, different tunnel section, same targets, same process. Advance, detect, engage, eliminate, continue. This was the pattern. This became an existence. By the end of the first month, we had cleared 14 tunnel sections and eliminated 97 confirmed targets. Casualty rate across all squads, 18%. 11 men terminated. 23 injured with varying degrees of severity. Most injuries resulted from close quarters contact, mandible strikes, claw damage. One case of partial limb amputation when a target managed to breach a squad's perimeter. The medical personnel performed what repairs they could. Those who could return to duty did. Those who could not were evacuated upward to the hive's medical facilities. I never learned what happened to them after that. They were no longer part of the operation. Their status became irrelevant to my function. Our squad maintained 0 casualties through month 1. Davros continued to move correctly. We continued to follow his patterns. I began to notice that I was adapting his movement techniques without conscious effort. The way he positioned his feet in unstable terrain. The way he checked side passages. Quick visual scan, immediate scanner confirmation, move on if clear. The way he listened between sonar pings. The machines told you what was there. Your ears told you what was moving. Both data sources were necessary. Month 2, the tunnels went deeper. We were now operating at depths exceeding 200 meters below the hive's foundation level. The temperature was increasing, 23 degrees in some sections, 26 in others. The air quality was degrading, higher concentrations of carbon dioxide, lower oxygen ratios. We adjusted our air supply consumption rates. Operations were reduced from 4 hours to 3 hours maximum before mandatory return to base. The targets were changing too. Larger specimens appeared, 3 meters confirmed. One case of a 4-meter contact that required sustained flamethrower operation and 17 shotgun slugs before it ceased function. Its body mass was sufficient that we couldn't move it for documentation. We recorded its position and continued. Command sent a recovery team later. I don't know what they learned from the corpse. We also began encountering evidence of organization. The tunnels in some sections had been modified, walls smoothed, debris cleared, side passages sealed with some kind of resinous material that our scanners couldn't properly analyze. The targets were not simply inhabiting the tunnels. They were maintaining them, possibly expanding them. This data was reported to command. They acknowledged and instructed us to continue clearance operations without deviation. I asked Davros what he thought about the modified tunnels. He said it meant the targets had been here longer than command's estimates suggested. You don't modify your environment unless you intend to stay. He said this while cleaning his shotgun, not looking at me. Then he said it also meant there were probably more of them than the surveys indicated. The motion signatures command showed us were based on random sampling. If the targets were organized, they could be concealing their numbers deliberately, staying in sections the surveys didn't reach. I asked if he thought we could clear the entire network with our current force size. He continued cleaning his weapon for another 10 seconds. Then he said probably not. But that wasn't our concern. Our concern was clearing our assigned sections. Command would determine strategic objectives. We performed tactical functions. I archived this conversation. It was the longest exchange Davros and I had about anything not directly related to immediate operations. Month 3. We lost Lasker. Not in our squad. He had been reassigned to another team for that operation because their shotgun specialist had been evacuated with a compound fracture. His new squad entered a tunnel section designated as low priority clearing. The scanner data indicated minimal activity. They advanced 600 meters before encountering a collapse. Not recent. The structural failure had occurred years before, possibly decades. But behind the collapse was a chamber, and in the chamber were 47 targets. The squad tried to withdraw. The tunnel geometry prevented effective retreat. Too narrow, too many targets, no flanking positions. They fought for 11 minutes. I know the duration because their Vox system transmitted until their power cells failed. I heard most of it. We were in an adjacent tunnel section. We couldn't reach them. The tunnel networks didn't connect at that depth. 3 members of that squad returned to the entry point. Lasker was not among them. His body was not recovered. The targets had dragged him, or what remained, deeper into the chamber before the survivors could withdraw. Command sealed that tunnel section, marked it for heavy ordnance deployment. I don't know if they ever deployed the ordnance. I never returned to that sector. I did not process grief correctly. I should note this. Lasker and I had trained together for 2 years. We had operated together for 3 months. I had observable data about his behavior patterns, his equipment preferences, his movement style. That data now had no application. He had become historical information. I logged his termination in my personal archive and continued to function. Davros asked if I was acceptable that evening. I said I was functional. He looked at me. We were in the barracks, preparing equipment for the next day's operation, and said that functionality wasn't the same as acceptable. But he didn't press the question. He returned to his equipment maintenance. I did the same. We descended the next morning. Same process. The tunnels did not care that Lasker was gone. The targets did not care. The operation continued. We cleared our assigned section, eliminated 14 contacts, returned to base. Debriefed. The pattern held. Month 4. Davros and I were assigned to a deep reconnaissance patrol. Just the 2 of us, no full squad. Command wanted mapping data from tunnel sections too narrow for standard squad operations. 2-man teams could cover more ground, required less air supply, and made less noise. The risk profile was significantly higher, but the data requirements justified the risk according to Command's assessment. We entered through a vertical shaft that descended 80 meters into a network we hadn't previously accessed. The tunnels here were different. Older, possibly. The stone surfaces had a different texture, smoother. Some sections appeared almost polished, as if something had moved through them repeatedly over extended time periods, wearing the stone down through continuous contact. The sonar painted strange geometry, chambers that seemed too regular to be natural. Passages that branched at precise angles. Davros commented that this looked like architecture, not human architecture. The scale was wrong, the proportions were wrong, but intentional design. Something had built this or shaped it deliberately. We advanced carefully. The scanner showed no immediate motion signatures, but the interference was worse here. The stone composition affected the sonar's penetration. We might have clear data for 20 meters, then the signal would scatter against some mineral deposit and we'd be effectively blind until we moved to a different position. At 400 meters, we found the first chamber. It was large, 30 meters diameter, maybe more. The scanner's range was insufficient to map the full space. The ceiling was higher than our lumen units could illuminate. The walls were covered in the resinous material we'd seen in other modified sections, but here it was thicker, more extensive, and there were patterns in it. Regular patterns, geometric designs that repeated across the surface. Davros approached one wall, examined the pattern closely. He didn't touch it. Doctrine prohibited contact with unknown substances. But he studied it for perhaps 20 seconds. Then he said it looked like writing. I asked if he could read it. He said no, but it had structure, repetition with variation. That was language, or mathematics. Same thing, depending on your perspective. I asked if we should report this immediately. He said we would report it when we returned. Right now, we need to finish the reconnaissance. Command's mission parameters required us to map at least 800 meters of tunnel before returning. We'd only covered 400. We continued. The chamber had 5 exits. We selected the largest passage and proceeded. The tunnel sloped downward at approximately 15 degrees. The temperature was 29 degrees now, significantly warmer than the sections above. I noted this in my log. The air quality was also degrading faster than predicted. We would need to turn back in 90 minutes, regardless of distance covered. At 600 meters, we encountered the first target. It was not moving. Initially, I thought it was dead. The body was motionless, positioned against one wall of the tunnel. But as we approached, the scanner registered respiration. Slow, rhythmic. I was sleeping, or whatever state these organisms entered when not active. The specimen was large, 3.5 meters estimated. The body was curled in a position that made precise measurement difficult. The chitinous plating was darker than other specimens we'd encountered, thicker, with mineral deposits along the ridge lines. It had been here a long time. Davros signaled, "Standard termination protocol." We aimed. I counted down silently. On 0, we fired simultaneously. The target woke as the first slugs impacted. It moved, not as fast as the smaller specimens, but with enormous force. It rose, turned toward us, and charged. The tunnel geometry gave us perhaps 8 meters of engagement range. We fired continuously. Davros emptied his magazine. I emptied mine. The target was still moving, 3 meters away, 2. It collapsed 1 meter from Davros's position. The momentum carried it forward another half meter. It stopped moving permanently approximately 5 centimeters from his boots. We reloaded, checked for additional contacts. The scanner showed nothing. We examined the corpse. The chitinous plating had stopped most of our slugs. I counted 14 impact points with minimal penetration. The shots that terminated it had entered through gaps in the armor where the segments joined. Precise targeting. We had been lucky, or we had aimed correctly without conscious thought. I'm still uncertain which. Davros looked at the corpse for a longer period than tactical necessity required. Then he said, "This was a guardian. Positioned here deliberately, protecting something deeper in the tunnel." I asked how he knew. He said because that's what he would do if he needed to protect something and had limited personnel. Put your strongest asset in the choke point. Make anything coming through expend resources, killing it. We had just expended 16 rounds and made considerable noise. Anything deeper in the tunnel now knew we were here. I asked if we should withdraw. He checked his chronometer. We had 53 minutes of air remaining. We could advance another 100 meters and still maintain a safe reserve for return. He said we will continue. Command's parameters required 800 meters. We were at 600. We continue. The next 200 meters were empty. No contacts, no additional chambers, just a tunnel, sloping gradually downward, getting warmer. 32 degrees when we reached the 800-meter mark. The air quality was marginal. Carbon dioxide levels were approaching uncomfortable ranges. We documented our position, marked the tunnel for future operations, and turned back. The return transit was faster. We moved through mapped territory with known threat status. We passed the Guardian's corpse without pausing, moved through the large chamber, began the ascent back toward the entry shaft. We were halfway to the surface when the Vox system activated. Command's voice, distorted by interference but comprehensible. All teams returned to base immediately. Emergency recall, no explanation provided. Just the order. We increased our pace. Reached the entry shaft 12 minutes later. Ascended. Emerged into the base level to find it in a state I had not observed before. Personnel moving rapidly. Equipment being secured. Command staff clustered around hololithic displays, showing data I couldn't pass from my position. Davros asked the nearest officer what was happening. The officer, a lieutenant whose name I don't have in the accessible archive, said seismic sensors had detected massive movement in the deep network. Something large, multiple signatures moving in coordinated patterns, approaching the cleared zones. I asked how large. The lieutenant said the displacement data suggested specimens significantly exceeding previous size estimates. 5 meters minimum, possibly larger, and there were many of them. Command was repositioning all squads to defensive postures. The clearance operation was being temporarily suspended. We were transitioning to containment protocol. Darvis and I reported to our squad's designated position. The others were already there. Tarek, Johan, Marcus. Not Lasker. His absence registered again as relevant data. We were a 5-man squad now. Below optimal strength, but still functional. The defensive line was established at the lowest base level. Engineers had constructed barrier positions using prefabricated sections, armored walls with firing ports, overlapping fields of fire, fallback positions if the primary line was breached. It was a solid defensive configuration. It was also an admission that we were no longer conducting offensive operations, we were holding ground. The first wave arrived 6 hours later. I'm going to dwell on this. Not because the violence was exceptional, though it was, but because this was when I understood what we were actually fighting. Up until that point, the targets had been obstacles. Problems requiring tactical solutions, organisms to be eliminated according to doctrine. But when they came in coordinated mass, I saw them as an entity, not individuals, a system, like we were a system. And the two systems were incompatible. One would continue, one would not. The scanner detected them at 400 meters. Multiple contacts. The display couldn't render individual signatures. They overlapped, merged, and created a solid mass of motion data. The sonar painted the tunnel as full. Wall to wall, floor to ceiling, a column of living matter advancing toward our position. Command gave the order. Flamethrower teams engage at maximum range. Shotgun teams hold for breakthrough targets. Do not waste ammunition on massed targets. Let the fire do the work. Tarek and Johan took forward positions. The other flamethrower teams did the same. I counted 12 flamethrowers total along the defensive line. When the targets reached effective range, all 12 opened fire simultaneously. The tunnel became light. The roar was continuous. The heat washed back over our position despite the distance. I observed the scanner display. The mass of signatures was slowing but not stopping. Targets in the front were burning, dying, falling. The ones behind climbed over them. Keep advancing. The flamethrowers burned continuously for 2 minutes, then 3, then 4. I had never seen sustained operation at that duration. The weapons weren't designed for it. Tarek's flamethrower began showing pressure irregularities. Johan's fuel gauge was approaching critical. The other teams were in similar states. At 5 minutes, Command ordered the flamethrowers to cease fire and fall back. Shotgun teams advanced to firing ports. Engage all contacts that breach the flame line. I moved to my assigned position. Davros took the port to my right, Marcus to my left. Through the port, I could see the tunnel. It was full of fire and smoke and bodies. The corpses were piled 2 meters high in some sections, but behind the flames, still advancing, were more targets. The first one emerged from the smoke at approximately 30 meters. It was large, 4 meters easily. It was burning but still moving. I fired, hit center mass. It staggered but continued. Davros fired, another hit. It came closer. Marcus fired. The target collapsed to 20 meters. Another emerged, then 3 more. Then I stopped counting because they were continuous. I fired, reloaded, fired again. The shotgun's recoil became rhythmical. Aim, fire, confirm target down or still moving. Aim at next target, fire. The process looped. My shoulder ached from the repeated impacts. I noticed this as peripheral data but did not allow it to affect my firing rate. The engagement lasted 37 minutes. I know because I checked the chronometer afterward. During the engagement, time was not measurable. There was only target, fire, reload, target, fire. Davros ran out of ammunition before I did. He fell back, retrieved additional magazines from the supply point, and returned to position. I ran out 6 minutes later. Same process. Marcus ran out twice. When it ended, and it did end eventually, the tunnel was impassable. The corpses filled the passage to a depth that would require engineer assets to clear. The defensive line had held. Casualty report. 4 wounded, none terminated. Ammunition expenditure. 73% of available stocks. Fuel expenditure. 81%. Command called it a successful defensive action. They also called it a tactical problem. We had held 1 tunnel. The seismic sensors indicated similar movements in 16 other tunnel sections. We did not have sufficient ammunition to repeat this engagement 16 times. We would require resupply before continuing operations. Resupply would take 6 weeks. For 6 weeks, we maintained defensive positions but conducted no offensive operations. I spent that time on guard duty, equipment maintenance, and attempting to process what I had observed. I say attempt because the processing did not complete successfully. I had data. I could not form conclusions from the data that felt adequate. Davros and I discussed this once during a guard shift. We were alone, monitoring a sealed tunnel section that showed no activity. He asked if I understood what we were doing here. I said we were clearing tunnels. He said no. We were performing attrition. The targets had numbers we couldn't match. We had technology they couldn't match. The question was, which advantage would exhaust first? I asked which he thought would exhaust first. He was quiet for approximately 20 seconds. Then he said it didn't matter what he thought. We would continue until command determined the operation was complete or until we were reassigned. Our opinions were not factors in that determination. I asked if he thought we could win. He looked at me then, actually turned away from the tunnel to look at me directly. He said winning wasn't the right word. We could achieve the mission objectives: clear the tunnels, establish containment, prevent contamination of the hive's inhabited levels. That was success by operational definition, but the targets would still exist. Somewhere. In deeper tunnels we hadn't found. In sections we couldn't reach. They had been here before we arrived. They would be here after we left. He said this without emotion, just observation. Then he returned to monitoring the tunnel. I did the same. The resupply arrived on schedule. Ammunition, fuel, replacement equipment, 10 additional personnel to offset casualties from other squads. We resumed offensive operations the following day. Month 5 was repetition. Descent, clearance, engagement, return. The pattern had become automatic. I no longer needed to consciously recall the procedures. My body performed them while my mind processed other data. I thought about the modified tunnels, the resinous patterns that might be language, the coordinated behaviors, the deep network where something large was moving. I thought about Lasker, though I tried not to. The data about him was archived. Accessing it served no operational purpose. But sometimes during the long descents into darkness, I would remember him checking his weapon in a specific way, or the comment he made once about preferring flechette rounds for close targets. Small data. Irrelevant data. I couldn't delete it. Month 6. We reached the deepest network level we had access to that point, 340 meters below the hive's foundation. The temperature was 38 degrees. The air was thick, difficult to breathe even with rebreather assistance. The tunnels here were all artificial. No natural cave formation. These had been excavated with purpose. We found another large chamber. This one was different. The walls were covered entirely in the resinous material, and in the center of the chamber was a structure. I don't have better terminology. It was not natural. It was not random. It had geometry that implied construction. The material was the same resin, but denser, formed into columns and arches and spaces that might have been functional. Storage, perhaps, or habitation, or something I didn't have concepts to describe. Davros examined it from a safe distance. He said this was infrastructure. They had built this. Recently, maybe, or maintained something older. Either way, it indicated long-term occupation. Permanent establishment. I asked if we should destroy it. He said our mission was clearance of biological targets, not demolition of structures. Command would determine what happened to the infrastructure after the area was secured. We documented the chamber thoroughly. Visual records, scanner data, dimensional measurements. Then we continued the sweep, found 6 more targets in the tunnels beyond the chamber, eliminated them per standard protocol, returned to base. I included the infrastructure discovery in my report. Command acknowledged. Made notes. Provided no guidance regarding future encounters with similar structures. Month 7. Tarek died. It was not dramatic. He was operating his flamethrower during a standard clearance operation. A pressure seal failed, not due to damage or improper maintenance. The equipment had simply reached the end of its operational lifespan. Components fail. This is predictable given sufficient usage cycles. The fuel line ruptured. Promethium sprayed across his torso and right arm, ignited immediately from the pilot light. He burned for approximately 4 seconds before John deployed emergency fire suppressant foam. The burns were extensive. The medical team extracted him to the surface. He died 6 hours later from complications related to inhalation damage. The burning had consumed the oxygen in his immediate vicinity. His lungs had been compromised before the external flames were suppressed. I observed the incident from 12 meters away. I could not have prevented it. The seal failure occurred too rapidly. By the time my visual processing recognized the fuel spray, he was already burning. Davros reached him first and began deploying his own fire suppressant. John arrived 2 seconds later with a larger unit. They performed correctly. Tarek still died. Our squad was now 4 personnel, below minimum effective strength for standard operations. Command assigned us a replacement flamethrower specialist 3 days later. His name was Corvin. He was younger than the rest of us. Newer training. He had not been part of our original cohort. He tried to integrate into the squad's operational patterns. He tried earnestly. But he was not Tarek. He moved differently. His timing was slightly off. Not wrong. He performed adequately, but different. Davros never corrected him, never commented on the differences. He simply adjusted his own positioning to accommodate Corvin's patterns. I did the same. Marcus and John did the same. We adapted. This is what you do when a component changes. You adapt the system. Month 8, I started having difficulty maintaining separation between operation time and rest time. I would return to the barracks and continue to see the scanner display in my visual field, the motion signatures, the tunnel geometry. I would close my eyes and the data was still there. I mentioned this to Davros. He said he had similar experiences. It was normal. Our brains were adapting to the environment. The data we needed for survival was being prioritized, kept in ready access, even when not immediately necessary. I asked if it would stop. He said probably not while we were still here. Maybe after reassignment. Maybe not even then. The patterns we were learning were deep patterns. Survival patterns. Those didn't delete easily. He said this while cleaning his weapon, always while performing some task. Davros rarely spoke without simultaneously doing something else. I think the divided attention helped him, made the conversation feel less direct. I asked him if he remembered what it felt like before the training, before the tunnels. He stopped cleaning his weapon. I looked at it for several seconds. Then he said he remembered data about before. Specific facts, where he grew up, what his compartment looked like. But the feeling of it, the experience of being that person in that place, that was archived too deep. He could access the information, but not the sensation. He resumed cleaning his weapon, said it was probably better that way. The person he was before couldn't have survived what we do now, That person had to be archived to make room for the person who could perform this function. I understood this. I had similar observations about my own memory structure. The boy who worked in the Forge World refineries no longer felt like me. He felt like someone I had observed, someone whose data I had inherited but whose identity I had not retained. I did not share this observation with Davros. He had already returned fully to his equipment maintenance. The conversation was complete. Month 9. We lost contact with 2 squads operating in the northern tunnel sections. They descended for a standard clearance operation and did not return at the scheduled extraction time. Command waited 4 hours beyond the deadline before declaring them missing. Recovery teams were dispatched. I was part of the 3rd recovery element. We found their entry point unsealed, equipment still in place at the top of the descent shaft. We went down. The shaft was clear. The initial junction showed no signs of struggle. We followed their logged route for 200 meters. Then the tunnel opened into a chamber we had not previously mapped. The chamber was large, 40 meters across, maybe larger. The ceiling extended beyond our lumen range. And the walls— I need to describe this precisely because the image has not degraded in my archive. The walls were covered in bodies. Not our people, the targets. Hundreds of them. Arranged in regular patterns, suspended in the resinous material, motionless, not dead, dormant. The scanner registered minimal life signs. Respiration at rates barely detectable. Metabolic function reduced to maintenance levels only. We stood in that chamber for perhaps 30 seconds before Davros signaled withdrawal. Nobody questioned the order. We moved back toward the entry shaft at speed. Professional speed, not panicked running, but faster than doctrine typically permitted. We did not stop until we reached the surface. The recovery team leader filed a report recommending immediate sealing of that sector. Command agreed. Engineers deployed demolition charges 2 days later, collapsed the tunnels leading to that chamber. I don't know if the charges penetrated deep enough to destroy the chamber itself or if they simply sealed the access points. I did not ask. The 2 missing squads were never recovered. 12 men. Their designations were logged as terminated with bodies irretrievable. I thought about those bodies on the walls, the arrangement, the preservation. I thought about this more than was operationally useful. Davros noticed. During a rest period, he asked what I was processing. I said I was attempting to understand the purpose of that chamber. Storage, hibernation, something else. He said it was probably all of those. The targets had numbers, they had organization. That chamber was resource management. Keep the population in suspended states until they're needed. Minimize resource consumption. Maximize available forces when required. It was efficient. It was what he would do if he commanded a force with limited resources and unlimited time. I said it suggested the targets were not simply defending territory. They were maintaining capability for future expansion. He said yes. That was the assessment. That was why Command had authorized the demolition. Containment protocol was no longer sufficient. This required elimination. But elimination required resources we didn't have. We were one clearance force. The tunnel networks extended for hundreds of kilometers. The target's numbers were unknown but clearly substantial. We had been here 7 months. No, 9 months, I corrected myself. And we had secured perhaps 15% of the mapped territory. The unmapped territory was larger. I asked Davos if he thought we would complete the mission. He was quiet. Then he said completion was a relative term. We would achieve what was achievable with available resources in the available time. Command would declare success when the tactical situation met acceptable parameters. Whether those parameters included total elimination of all targets or simply sufficient reduction to prevent immediate threat to the hive. That wasn't our determination to make. He paused, then added that most likely we would be here until we were reassigned or until we died. Those were the usual conclusion points for operations like this. The targets wouldn't surrender. We wouldn't stop. The math resolved to attrition. Which side could sustain losses longer? I filed this assessment in my archive. It felt accurate. It also felt inevitable. I experienced something then that I'm going to call resignation, though the word doesn't capture the full data. Not despair. Despair implied hope had existed and been lost. I don't think I had hope. I had a function, and the function would continue until it didn't. Month 10, we began encountering targets that has been modified, augmented possibly, or naturally variant. I lack sufficient data to determine which. These specimens had additional armor plating, reinforced limb structures, and they moved with coordinated precision that exceeded previous behavioral patterns. The first modified target we encountered required 43 rounds and sustained flamethrower operation before termination. It had been alone. A single specimen holding a tunnel section against our entire squad. When we examined the corpse, Marcus pointed out the armor plating patterns. They looked deliberately applied. Not grown, attached. Some kind of metallurgical compound fused to the chitin. Davros documented this extensively, said it was tool use. They were adapting, learning from encounters with us, developing countermeasures. Command's response was predictable. Increase firepower allocation. Deploy armor-penetrating ammunition. Extend flamethrower engagement durations. We received updated equipment 3 days later. Heavier slugs. Modified fuel mixture that burned hotter and adhered to surfaces more effectively. The weight increased. My equipment load went from 42 kilograms to 47. You adapted your movement patterns, or you failed to keep pace. I adapted. Month 11, we were operating at depths exceeding 400 meters. The temperature was 41 degrees, the same temperature as the Forge World refineries where my father had worked. I noted this parallel. It felt significant in some way I couldn't articulate. Heat was simply heat. Thermal energy. But experiencing this specific temperature in this specific context created connections to archived data I thought I'd isolated. I remembered. No, I accessed the archived record. I accessed the memory of my father sitting in our compartment, his hands showing burn patterns, not speaking, just sitting, processing something internal. I was perhaps 8 years old. I didn't understand what he was processing then. I understand now. He was carrying the weight of repetition. The knowledge that the next shift would be identical to the last, that the refineries would continue regardless of his presence, that he was a component in a system that would replace him if he failed. I was performing the same function now, different systems, same principle. Davros asked if I was functional. We were in a tunnel junction, waiting for Corvin to complete a scanner sweep of the branching passages. I said I was functional. He looked at me, actually stopped his equipment check and looked directly at me. and said I wasn't processing correctly. My response times were degrading. He had observed this over the last 2 weeks. I was still performing adequately, but the margins were narrowing. I asked what he recommended. He said rest would help if rest were available. But we were on continuous operation cycles. 6 hours down, 4 hours surface time for equipment maintenance and minimal sleep. 6 hours down again. The pattern had been ongoing for 3 weeks. Command was pushing operational tempo because seismic sensors indicated the targets were excavating new tunnel sections, expanding their network faster than we could clear it. We were losing ground progressively. I said I understood the operational necessity. He said understanding it didn't mean we could sustain it indefinitely. People weren't machines. We had operational limits. Those limits were approaching. Then he returned to his equipment check. Corvin completed his scanner sweep. We continue the operation. Month 12. Johan was injured during an engagement with multiple modified targets. Mandible strike to his left leg. The chitin penetrated through his armor and severed the primary artery. We applied emergency medical procedures. Tourniquets, coagulants, vascular sealant. He remained conscious throughout. He knew the injury was terminal if we didn't extract him immediately. Davros made the decision. Abort the operation, full squad withdrawal, get Johan to the medical teams. We moved fast. Johan couldn't walk. Marcus and Corvin carried him. Davros and I maintained rear security. The return to the surface took 43 minutes. John was still alive when we delivered him to the medical station. He died during surgery. The trauma was too extensive. They performed their function correctly. The damage simply exceeded repair capability. Our squad was now 3 personnel. Me, Davros, Marcus. Corvin was there too, but he had only been with us for 4 months. Not long enough. The original squad had been 6. Now, 3. The math was clear. Command assigned us 2 replacement specialists. I don't remember their names. This is not archival corruption. I never retained their names. They were designated as replacements. They performed their functions, but they were not part of the original unit. The connections that had formed through training and shared operations, those didn't exist with them. They were new components in a system that had already learned to function with different components. I mentioned this to Davros. We were in the barracks. He was maintaining his shotgun. Always maintaining his shotgun. He said this was the cycle. Original members die or are injured. Replacements arrive. Eventually all original members are gone. The unit continues, but it's not the same unit. It has the same designation, but the components are entirely different. He said this had already happened. Our squad wasn't the squad that trained together. That squad had ended when Lasker died, then again when Tarek died, then again when Johan died. We were on the 4th or 5th iteration now. He had lost count. I asked if that meant the connections between current members were less significant. He stopped cleaning his weapon. Said no. The connections were just as significant to the people experiencing them, but they were temporary by design. The system didn't allow for permanent connections. Those would compromise operational effectiveness when separation occurred. I asked if he felt that separation had compromised his effectiveness when the others died. He resumed his weapon maintenance. Said he wasn't the person to assess that objectively. He continued to function. Command continued to deploy him. The outcome metrics suggested adequacy, but he had felt it. I knew this. I had observed him after Terek's death. The way he checked his flamethrower connections 3 times instead of the standard 2. The way he positioned himself during operations, slightly forward, taking point more consistently, placing himself at greater risk. Not dramatically, not suicide behavior, just incremental repositioning that put him in the highest danger areas, marginally more often. I didn't mention these observations. They were personal data. Sharing them served no operational purpose. Month 13. I had lost track somewhat. Had to check my logs to confirm the count. Month 13 we went deeper than we had ever operated before. 460 meters. The orders came from command without explanation. A specific tunnel section, a specific set of coordinates, high priority target designation. Full squad deployment with extended operation window, 8 hours. We descended. The tunnel geometry was unusual, too regular. Perfectly circular cross-section, 3 meters diameter, sloping downward at a consistent angle. The walls were smooth, not the polished appearance of natural wear. This looked manufactured. Machine precision. Davros commented on this. Said the targets didn't have machinery, at least not that we had observed. So either they did and we hadn't seen it yet, or something else had created this tunnel. He didn't speculate what something else might be. Neither did I. At 200 meters, the tunnel opened into a complex, not a single chamber. Multiple chambers connected by passages arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate planning. The scanner couldn't map the full extent. The space was too large, too complex. We proceeded carefully. The first chamber was empty. Resinous material on the walls, but no targets, no infrastructure. The second chamber contained equipment. I'm calling it equipment because I lack proper terminology. Objects, constructed objects, metal and stone and the resinous material combined into structures whose function I couldn't determine. They weren't weapons. They weren't obviously tools. They just existed, arranged in specific patterns. Davros photographed everything. Marcus maintained scanner observation. The replacements covered our flanks. I examined one of the objects closely without touching it. The construction showed precision. Joints fitted together with tolerances that required advanced manufacturing capability. But the design aesthetic was completely foreign. The proportions were wrong for human use. The interface points, if they were interface points, were positioned for different limb configurations. We moved through 6 more chambers, all similar, objects whose purposes were unclear. In the 7th chamber we found targets. 5 of them. Larger than standard specimens, 3.5 to 4 meters. They weren't dormant. They were active, apparently engaged in some kind of task involving the objects in that chamber. They detected us immediately. The engagement was brief and intense. Corvin deployed his flamethrower. The chamber filled with fire. The targets moved through the flames, burning but still functional. Davros, Marcus, and I fired continuously. One of the replacements fired. The other had frozen. Target panic, common in newer personnel under extreme stress. The engagement lasted maybe 45 seconds. All 5 targets were terminated. One of them had closed to within 3 meters of our position before it stopped. We regrouped. The replacement, who had frozen, was shaking. Davros told him to check his weapon, verify it was functional, and remain alert. Direct instructions. Simple tasks. This helped with target panic. Give the mind something specific to do and it stops cycling in fear loops. We continued to the 8th chamber. It was the largest we had seen, 50 meters across minimum. The ceiling was high. Our lumen units couldn't reach it, and in the center of this chamber was a structure that I'm going to describe as carefully as possible because I still see it when I close my eyes, and the image has not degraded. The structure was approximately 20 meters tall, composed primarily of the resinous material, but with metal components integrated throughout. It had a central column with branching sections that extended outward and upward in geometric patterns. The patterns repeated at different scales, the same angular relationships appearing in large branches and small details, and the entire structure was covered in the writing we had seen in other locations. Dense text covering every surface. Davros approached it slowly. The scanner showed no motion signatures in the immediate area. He said this was important. Central location, largest chamber, most complex structure. This was either administrative, ceremonial, or functional infrastructure. He couldn't determine which. Possibly all three. I asked if we should document and withdraw or continue deeper. He checked his chronometer. We had been in the complex for 4 hours. We had 4 hours remaining in our operation window. He said we document this thoroughly, then continue to the planned termination point. We spent 30 minutes photographing the structure from every angle. Marcus did detailed scanner mapping. I recorded dimensional measurements. The replacement personnel maintained security. Then we moved to the chamber's far exit and continued. The next tunnel section sloped upward briefly, then descended sharply. We followed it for 300 meters. The temperature was increasing, 44 degrees. The air quality was poor. High carbon dioxide, elevated particulates. Breathing was laborious, even with rebreather assistance. At the end of this tunnel was another chamber, smaller, perhaps 15 meters in diameter, and it was occupied. The target was massive, 5 meters at minimum, possibly larger. It was difficult to measure accurately because it was positioned in a way that compressed its body profile. The armor plating was extensive, thick, darker than any specimen we had encountered. And it was awake. It had been watching the tunnel entrance. Waiting. Davros didn't signal. I didn't need to. We all understood simultaneously. This was what Command had sent us to find. High priority target. This one specifically. The complex, the structure, all of it was built around this specimen's presence here. Corvin deployed his flamethrower without waiting for authorization. The chamber filled with fire. The target moved. Not toward us, sideways, out of the direct flame path. Fast. Faster than anything that size should move. It circled along the chamber wall. Davros fired. Hit it. The round impacted the armor and deflected. Marcus fired. Similar results. I adjusted my aim point. Targeted the gaps between armor plates. Fired 3 rounds in rapid succession. 1 penetrated. The target's movement pattern changed. Not slowed, altered. It stopped circling and charged directly toward us. The next 17 seconds, I checked my recording later, confirmed the duration, were entirely reactive. There was no thought, no planning, only target acquisition, fire, movement, fire again. Corvin maintained a continuous flamethrower stream. The rest of us fired as fast as we could, acquire valid aim points. The target crossed the chamber. 10 meters, 7, 5. It collapsed at 3 meters from Davros's position, exactly like the first large target we had encountered. Almost the same distance, the same position. Davros at the focal point. But this target was not quite dead. It was dying, but still processing. Its limbs moved weakly. The mandibles opened and closed, and it made a sound. Not the screaming we had heard from other specimens. This was different. Lower frequency, modulated. It had patterns, rhythmic variations. Davros stepped closer. I told him to maintain distance. He ignored me. He stood perhaps 1 meter from the target's head region and listened to the sound for maybe 20 seconds. Then the sound stopped. The target stopped moving permanently. I asked Davros what he had heard. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said there was communication, not distress vocalization, no pain response. Communication, language. The target had been saying something. He didn't know what. But it had been deliberate vocalization with structured content. Marcus asked if targets had language. Davros said apparently yes. We just hadn't heard it before. Or maybe we had and didn't recognize it as language. The sounds they made during combat. We classified those as screaming, but maybe some of those sounds were also communication. Warnings, tactical coordination. We didn't know because we had never studied it. We just killed them. The replacement, who had experienced target panic earlier, asked if that mattered. If they had language. Did that change anything? Davros looked at him and said no. It didn't change anything. Our orders were elimination. Language didn't modify the orders. It just meant we were eliminating something more complex than the briefing data suggested. We documented the corpse, the chamber, the approach tunnel, verified all scanner data was archived. Then we withdrew. The return to the surface took 3 hours. We delivered our report to command. They acknowledged, made notes, provided no feedback about the significance of our findings. I processed this operation for several days afterward. The structure, the writing, the target's vocalization. These data points suggested complexity we had not been briefed to expect. The targets weren't simply animals infesting tunnels. They had architecture, written language, vocal communication, social organization. They were building something down there. Not just nests or dens, infrastructure, society. I mentioned this to Davros during a maintenance period. He said he had reached the same assessment. The question was what command would do with that assessment. If the targets were organized at that level, elimination might not be achievable with our current force structure. You couldn't simply clear them out like vermin. They would adapt, rebuild. Resistance would be strategic rather than instinctive. He said it probably didn't matter. Our function was clearance operations as assigned. Command would determine strategic response. We would continue tactical execution until instructed otherwise. I asked if he ever wanted to know the larger strategic picture. He said wanting was irrelevant. We had the information we needed to perform our function. Additional information would not change our actions, therefore it was unnecessary information. But he had paused before answering, a small pause. Perhaps half a second. Enough that I noticed. Month 14. Or perhaps 15 my log entries had become irregular. We received new orders. Deep penetration operation. Return to the complex we had previously documented. Eliminate all remaining targets in that sector. Plant monitoring equipment. Seal the sector. This was a termination operation. Not reconnaissance. Not mapping. We were being sent to eliminate everything in that complex and ensure it couldn't be reoccupied. We descended with additional equipment. Demolition charges. Sealing foam. autonomous monitoring drones. Our squad plus 2 additional squads, 18 personnel total. The largest single operation I had participated in. The approach was different this time. We knew the route. We moved faster, with more confidence. We reached the complex in half the time of our first visit. The chambers were still empty initially. We began systematic clearing, chamber by chamber, deploying sensors, checking for concealed passages or targets. In the 4th chamber we found them. Not 5 targets this time, 23, multiple size categories. They had been waiting in a side chamber we hadn't detected during the first visit. When we entered, they emerged immediately. The engagement was extensive. All 3 squads fired simultaneously. 2 flamethrowers are active. The chamber became chaotic. Targets moving at multiple speeds, small ones rushing forward, large ones following. The scanner display was useless. Too many contacts, too much movement. We fired based on visual acquisition. Target, fire, acquire next target, fire. I don't know how long it lasted. Time became non-linear under those conditions, but eventually the firing stopped. The chamber was full of corpses and smoke. Casualty check, 3 wounded, none terminated. Ammunition expenditure, critical levels. We had perhaps 40% of our starting loadout remaining. The squad leader, a sergeant whose name I should remember but don't, made the decision. We couldn't continue deep clearing with our current ammunition status. We would plant the monitoring equipment in the chambers we had already cleared, withdraw, resupply, and return if the monitors detected activity. This was a reasonable tactical decision. We executed as ordered, deployed the drones in 6 chambers, activated them, verified transmission signals were reaching the surface, then began our withdrawal. We were halfway back to the entry shaft when the Vox system activated. Not our squad's Vox. The broadcast came from Command's channel, full override, all personnel. The message was brief. Seismic activity detected. Major displacement. All squads withdraw immediately to the surface. Emergency extraction protocol. We increased pace to emergency speed. Behind us, the tunnels began to vibrate. Not surface vibration. Deep structural movement. The walls were shifting. Davros grabbed my shoulder, pushed me forward. Keep moving, don't stop. The tunnel behind us collapsed. I heard it more than saw it, the sound of massive stone failure. Dust and debris rushed past us. The lumen units created strange effects in the dust cloud. Shadows and light fragments that looked almost like figures moving. We ran. Marcus fell. I stopped, pulled him up. Corvin was ahead, still moving. The replacement personnel were somewhere behind. I couldn't see them through the dust. Davros was beside me. We moved together, Marcus between us. The entry shaft was ahead. 50 meters. 40. The cable rigs were still deployed. We reached them. Davros went first and established that the cables were still secure. Signaled us up. I helped Marcus attach his harness. Send him up. Corvin was already climbing. I attached my harness. I looked back into the tunnel. Through the dust I saw one of the replacement personnel. He was running toward us. 20 meters away. Then the tunnel roof collapsed directly above him. He disappeared under the stone fall. Just gone. One moment running, next moment buried. Davros pulled my harness. Told me to climb. We couldn't help the replacement. The collapse was total. I climbed. We emerged at the surface. Did accountability. Our squad, Davros, myself, Marcus, Corvin. The 2 replacements were gone. One crushed in the collapse, the other missing, location unknown. The other 2 squads, 11 personnel returned of 12 deployed. Total casualties, 4. Command debriefed us immediately. The seismic event had been massive. Multiple tunnel sections collapsed simultaneously. The monitoring drones we had deployed were offline. No signal transmission. The entire complex had likely collapsed or been sealed by the substrate displacement. The sergeant from the lead squad asked if this was natural seismic activity or something else. Command said the displacement pattern was not consistent with natural events. It appeared to have originated from specific focal points in the deep network, below our operating depth. Something had triggered it, or someone. The targets, deliberately collapsing tunnels to prevent our access. Davros said this quietly, to me specifically, not to the command staff, but several others had clearly reached the same conclusion. If the targets could trigger controlled collapses, they had capability beyond our assessment. They could deny us access to entire sectors, force us into specific approach routes, create kill zones. This was military engineering, strategic defensive construction. Command acknowledged these observations, stated that strategic assessment was being revised. Our orders were to maintain defensive positions at the current base level. No further deep penetration operations until Command determined revised operational protocols. This was the first time in 14 months. I had confirmed my log count, it was 14 months. That we had been ordered to cease offensive operations for reasons other than resupply. We were being held in position, not withdrawn, not redeployed, just held. Month 15 was waiting. Guard duty, equipment maintenance, physical conditioning to prevent degradation. But no operations. The tunnels below us remained sealed. The monitoring systems showed no activity in the upper sections. Whatever was deeper down was staying there. Davros became quiet during this period. He had always been economical with speech, but now he barely spoke outside of operational necessity. He maintained his equipment obsessively. I observed him cleaning his shotgun 3 times in one day. The weapon was already clean. He was performing the maintenance ritual because it was something to do, something he could control when everything else was determined by Command's decisions. I asked him once if he was having difficulty with the operational pause. He said it was disorienting. We had been in continuous engagement cycles for 14 months. Stop and start, but always continuing. Now we were just stopped. The momentum was gone. He didn't know how to exist in the pause. His function was clearance operations. Without operations, what was his function? I said our function was to await orders and maintain readiness. He said yes. That was the technical answer, but it didn't feel like a function. It felt like suspension, existing without purpose, just maintenance of capability for potential future deployment. He was quiet for a while. Then he said Tarek and John and Lasker didn't have to experience this. They had died during active operations. They had been performing functions up until termination. There was some, he paused, searching for the word, some completion in that. Ending while still functional. Not ending during a pause. I understood what he was processing. The fear wasn't death during operations. That was acceptable. The fear was death during a pause. Termination without having completed anything. Just interruption. I told him this pause would end. We would receive new orders eventually. He said probably. But maybe not before something else ended us. Illness, equipment failure, random structural collapse. Men died in garrison positions too. Those deaths had less meaning. No enemy killed you. You just stopped. This was the longest philosophical conversation Darius and I ever had. It occurred in the barracks, both of us maintaining equipment we had already maintained twice that day. Just talking to occupy the time. To create human connection in a space that had been stripped of most human elements. Month 16. The pause ended. New orders arrived. Not return to clearance operations. Redeployment. Our entire force was being moved to a different subsector. Different hive, new tunnel networks. The situation at Hive Praxis was being handed to a follow-on force with different capabilities. Heavy equipment, drilling platforms. They would approach the problem with industrial solutions rather than infantry clearance. We were no longer needed here. I processed this information with difficulty. We have been here for 16 months. We had cleared hundreds of tunnel sections, eliminated thousands of targets, lost, I checked my logs, 47 personnel from our original deployment, and now we were simply leaving. The operation was incomplete. The targets remained in the deep networks. We had not achieved our mission objectives. Command's statement was that we had achieved sufficient objectives to reduce immediate threat to acceptable parameters. The Hive's inhabited sections were secure. The monitoring systems were in place. The follow-on force would address remaining concerns. This was how operations ended, apparently. Not with completion. With sufficiency. With acceptable parameters. You performed your function until Command determined that continuing your function was less valuable than redeploying you elsewhere. Davris said this was correct. Most operations ended this way. Very few military objectives were actually completed. You pushed the situation toward improved parameters. Then you moved on. The war continued elsewhere. You continued elsewhere. But he said it without his usual flatness. There was something in his voice. Not emotion exactly. Friction. The words didn't come out smoothly. We packed our equipment. Prepared for transport. The extraction was scheduled for 2 days from the order. 48 hours to finalize all tasks, secure all materials, board the transports. On the final day, Davris asked if I wanted to see it one more time. I asked what he meant. He said the tunnels. One last descent before we left. Not an official operation. Just personal observation. He had clearance to access the upper levels for equipment verification purposes. We could go down for 30 minutes, see the space we had lived in for 16 months, then come back up and leave. I asked why he wanted to do this. He said he didn't know. It just felt necessary. Some kind of... He paused again. Some kind of acknowledgement. The tunnels had changed him, changed both of us. Leaving without acknowledging that felt incomplete. I agreed. We descended alone. Just the two of us. No full squad. No mission parameters. We went to one of the junction chambers we had cleared early in the operation. Month 2, according to my logs. One of the first major chambers we had secured. The chamber was exactly as we had left it. The monitoring equipment we had installed was still functioning, indicator lights blinking in regular patterns. The walls still showed scoring from flamethrower operations. The floor had patches of discolored stone where targets had died, and their fluids had stained the substrate. Davris stood in the center of the chamber and turned slowly, looking at everything. Not scanning for threats, just observing, archiving, I did the same. He said this chamber was where he had first understood what we were actually doing. Not the mission briefing version, the real version. We were feeding bodies into darkness and hoping the darkness would eventually be satisfied. But darkness didn't satisfy. It was just consumed. We could fill these tunnels with corpses. Theirs, ours, didn't matter. And the darkness would accept them all and remain dark. I said that was accurate observation. He said yes, but we had done it anyway. Because that was the function. You didn't need to believe the function would achieve its stated purpose. You just needed to perform it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said Lasker had died in a tunnel 300 meters from this position. Tarek had been carrying a flamethrower just like the one he was carrying now. John had covered this exact junction from that position, pointing to a specific spot along the wall. They had performed their functions here. Then they stopped, and we continued. And now we were stopping too, and someone else would continue. I asked if he thought the next group would complete what we started. He said no. They would perform their functions for whatever duration they were assigned. Then they would stop too, and others would follow. The pattern would repeat until command determined the resources required exceeded the value gained. Then they would seal everything and declare success by whatever metrics allowed them to declare success. The targets would still be down there, in the deep places we never reached. They would rebuild, expand. Eventually someone would detect them again. The cycle would repeat. He asked if I thought the targets understood this, that they were part of a cycle, that they couldn't win any more than we could win. They could only continue until they were stopped, or until they stopped us. I said I didn't know. Their consciousness was unknown. Their processing of abstract concepts like winning or losing or cycles was pure speculation. Davros said he thought they understood. That large one we killed, the one that vocalized, that was trying to communicate something. Maybe it was saying this exact thing, that we were both trapped, both performing functions we couldn't escape, both feeding the same darkness. I didn't respond. The observation was too large. I couldn't process it completely. We stood in that chamber for the full 30 minutes, not talking, just existing in that space. Then Davros signaled and we returned to the surface. We boarded the transport the next morning. The journey to the new deployment was 6 weeks objective. The transport conditions were poor. Overcrowded, the environmental system struggled to maintain adequate air quality with the personnel density. Men became ill. I remained functional. Davros remained functional. Marcus developed a respiratory infection that required medical intervention. Corvin was fine. The transport continued. We made a translation using the new system. Different hive, same function. The deployment briefing was familiar. Tunnel networks beneath habitation levels. Motion signatures detected. Potential contamination risk. Clearance operations required. Expected duration, uncertain. Expected casualty rate, moderate to high. We had done this before. The pattern would repeat. But something had changed during the pause. During that final descent to the junction chamber, I couldn't specify what precisely. But Davros was different, quieter, if that was possible. He performed his equipment maintenance with the same precision. He moved correctly during operations, but there was an absence. Something that had been present before was no longer there. I asked him once, 2 months into the new deployment, if he was still processing correctly. He said he was functional. I said functional wasn't what I asked. He looked at me the way he had looked at me before. Direct eye contact. Said he was processing everything. All the data, every operation, every casualty, every target, every tunnel. He was archiving it all. The archive was becoming very large. Sometimes he couldn't access other functions because the archive was using too much capacity. But he was still functional. Command deployed him. He performed. The metrics suggested adequacy. I didn't ask again. Month 4, the new location, we were operating in a section that was partially flooded. Water seepage from some geological source. The tunnels had standing water up to knee height in some sections. This created complications. The scanner's sonar was disrupted by the water. The flamethrowers' effectiveness was reduced. Movement was slower. We were in a flooded tunnel section, advancing carefully, when we encountered a large target. 4 meters. Modified armor. It emerged from a side passage directly into our formation. Close range. Less than 5 meters. Corvin deployed his flamethrower. The water reduced the weapon's range. The fire reached the target, but without full saturation. The target came through the flames. Came directly to Davros. He fired. I fired. Marcus fired. Multiple hits. The target didn't stop. It reached Davros, struck him with one of its armored limbs. The impact threw him backward. He hit the tunnel wall. I fell into the water. I continued firing. Marcus continued firing. Corvin adjusted his aim and deployed a second burst directly into the target's face region. It finally stopped, collapsed into the water. Davros was not moving. I reached him first, pulled his head above water. He was unconscious. There was blood in the water. I couldn't determine the source immediately. Marcus helped me stabilize him. Corvin maintained security while we performed emergency medical procedures. The impact had fractured several ribs. Possible internal bleeding. Concussion confirmed. We needed to extract him immediately. We called for emergency retrieval. Began moving toward the entry point. Davros regained consciousness during the movement. He tried to walk. Couldn't maintain balance. We carried him. The Medicaid team took him when we reached the surface. I waited outside the medical facility for 6 hours. They eventually informed me that he would survive. The internal bleeding had been controlled. The fractures would heal. The concussion was moderate, but not severe. He would require 4 to 6 weeks recovery before returning to operations. I was reassigned to a different squad temporarily. Davros went to the recovery ward. I visited him twice. Both times he was asleep or sedated. I didn't wake him. I just observed that he was still alive and left. 4 weeks later, he returned to duty. Physically healed according to medical assessment. We were assigned back to the same squad. When I saw him in the staging area before our first operation post-recovery, I noted differences. He moved more carefully, not hesitantly, but with deliberate caution that hadn't been present before. The unconscious speed was gone. During that operation, he performed adequately. He checked corners correctly. He fired when appropriate. He communicated clearly. But he didn't take point. When positions were selected, he chose center formation rather than forward. He was protecting himself now in ways he hadn't before. I asked him afterward if the injury had changed his processing. He said it had recalibrated his risk assessment. He had understood intellectually that he could be injured or killed, but experiencing it, actually being struck with sufficient force to break bones and lose consciousness, that had converted intellectual understanding to experiential data. The experiential data modified his behavior patterns. He said this was probably positive. His previous risk tolerance had been suboptimal. He had been exposing himself to excessive danger. The injury had corrected this. He would be more effective now by being more conservative. I didn't contradict him, but I observed over the next several operations that his effectiveness was not increasing. It was decreasing, not dramatically, but the margins that had made him exceptional were narrowing. He was becoming average, still adequate, still functional, but no longer the person who moved correctly before everyone else understood why. Month 7, at the new location we were operating at moderate depth. 200 meters, standard clearance operation, multiple squads coordinating to clear a network section. Our squad was assigned to a side passage. Low priority, expected low contact rate. We advanced through the passage. It opened into a small chamber, perhaps 8 meters across, and it was occupied. Not by targets, by something else. There was a device in the center of the chamber. I'm calling it a device because that's the closest terminology I have. It was mechanical, or partially mechanical, metal components arranged in specific geometry, integrated with organic material, or material that had been organic. The boundary between the mechanical and biological elements was unclear. The device was active. Portions of it were moving, rotating, oscillating, creating sound at frequencies that were uncomfortable, not painful, but wrong. The frequencies made my teeth hurt, made my inner ear register false balance signals. Davros approached it. I told him to maintain distance. He ignored me again. He stood perhaps 2 meters from the device and observed it for approximately 30 seconds. Then he reached out and touched one of the mechanical components. The device stopped moving. The sound stopped. Then it began again, but different. The frequency changed. The movement patterns changed. Davros jerked his hand back. "Look at me," said the device had responded to his touch. It was interactive. It had recognized input and modified its operation accordingly. I said we should withdraw and report this. He said yes. But he kept watching it. He said this was what the targets were building, not just tunnels, not just infrastructure. They were constructing systems, technologies, things we didn't understand but that had function and purpose and responsiveness. He said we were not fighting animals. We were fighting a civilization, an intelligence that built things and modified them and responded to interaction, and we were sent to kill them with shotguns and fire. I said the assessment was above our operational authority. Our function was clearance. He said yes. Clearance. Eliminate the targets. But we weren't eliminating them. We were interrupting them. Temporarily. They would rebuild after we left. They would build more of these devices, more complexes, more tunnels, and someone else would be sent to interrupt them again. He said this quietly, flatly, without emotion, but also without the certainty that had always characterized his statements. This was observation without conclusion, data without resolution. We withdrew, reported the device, command acknowledged, sent a specialist team to investigate it. I don't know what they concluded. We were not informed of their findings. Davros became quieter after that. During operations, he performed adequately. During rest periods, he maintained his equipment and said nothing. I tried to engage him several times. Asked if he was processing correctly. Asked if he needed medical evaluation. Asked if he wanted to discuss anything. He said he was functional. The archive was large but manageable. He would continue performing his function until he couldn't. Month 9, we were operating at depth again, 300 meters. The tunnels here were old. The walls showed deterioration patterns, suggesting centuries of existence. We found evidence of previous human presence, mining equipment, ancient, pre-hive construction era possibly, long abandoned. We also found corpses, human corpses, not recent, decades old minimum, partially preserved by the tunnel conditions. Cold, dry air in this section. The bodies showed signs of violence, not combat injuries, execution patterns. They had been killed deliberately and left here. Davros examined them. Count them. 17 bodies, all male. Similar age range, estimated 20s to 30s. Their equipment was basic. Mining tools primarily. No weapons. He said these were probably workers, sealed in the tunnels deliberately, either left to die or killed and left at disposal. I asked why this would be done. He said efficiency. The hive's construction required enormous labor forces. When sections were complete, the labor forces became unnecessary. You could transport them back to the surface, process them through discharge procedures, and reassign them, or you could seal them in the tunnels they had just finished building. The second option required fewer resources. He said this while looking at the corpses, not looking at me. Said we were the same as them. Labor forces performing functions. When our function was complete, or when continuing our function became inefficient, we would be disposed of similarly. Maybe not sealed in tunnels, but reassigned to higher risk operations, or deployed to combat zones where casualty rates were approaching 100%, or simply archived as no longer mission essential. The system is consumed. That was its function. Consuming people was just part of the larger consumption process. I said this was speculation. He said yes, but it was speculation based on observable patterns. The Imperium's scale required constant consumption, resources, materials, people, all of it fuel for continuation. We were fuel. So were the targets. So were the workers sealed in this tunnel. All fuel. We completed the operation, reported the corpses. Command acknowledged, made notes, provided no guidance regarding their disposal. That was the last operation Davros and I conducted together. 2 days later, he was reassigned. Not to a different squad, out of tunnel clearance operations entirely. Command provided no explanation. I attempted to access information about his reassignment. I was told the information was not available at my clearance level. I asked our squad leader what had happened. He said Davros had been flagged for psychological evaluation based on recent after-action reports. The evaluation had determined he was no longer suitable for clearance operations. He'd been reassigned to garrison duty at the hive's upper levels. Standard procedure for personnel who developed adaptability issues. I asked if adaptability issues meant he was being retired from combat operations. The squad leader said probably. But that wasn't my concern. I needed to focus on my own function. A replacement would be assigned within 48 hours. I did not accept this adequately. Davros had been with me since training. 22 months. I checked my logs, confirmed the duration. 22 months of shared operations. He was the primary bond, the connection that had persisted through multiple squad reorganizations. and he was simply gone, reassigned, archived to a different function. I attempted to locate him. The garrison areas were extensive. Personnel numbers were too large to search efficiently. I submitted a request for his location through official channels. The request was denied. I was informed that personnel connections outside operational necessity were discouraged. I should focus on integration with my new squad configuration. The replacement arrived the next day. His name was... I don't have this archived. I never retained it. He was adequate. He performed his function. The squad continued operations, but I was not processing correctly. I had lost access to something essential. Davos had been the component that made the system function optimally. Without him, the patterns were wrong. I still performed my function, but the certainty was gone. I second-guessed positions. I hesitated during engagements. My response times degraded. The squad leader noted this during the after-action review, said my performance metrics were declining. I needed to recalibrate or I would be flagged for evaluation like Davros. I said I understood. I attempted to recalibrate. I failed to recalibrate adequately. Month 10, I was in a tunnel engagement. Standard operation. We encountered multiple targets. I was assigned to cover a specific angle. A target approached from that angle. I saw it. I raised my weapon. I didn't fire. Not because I chose not to fire. Because the processing cycle didn't complete. I observed the target. I recognized it required elimination, but the signal from recognition to action didn't transmit correctly. Marcus fired. Eliminated the target. The engagement continued. We completed the operation successfully. But afterward, Marcus asked why I hadn't fired. I said the processing had experienced a delay. He said delay in tunnel combat was how people died. I needed to report the issue to Medicare. I didn't report it. I archived it as an isolated incident. Attempted to continue functioning. 2 operations later, it happened again. Different situation, but same failure. Observation without action. Marcus covered me again. This time he reported it to the squad leader. I was pulled from operations and sent to medical evaluation. The evaluation took 4 days. Multiple specialists. They performed cognitive testing, psychological assessment, neural response mapping. They concluded I was experiencing operational stress degradation. My processing systems were being overwhelmed by accumulated trauma data. The archive I had built, all the operations, all the casualties, all the observations, was too large. It was interfering with real-time function. They said this was common in long-term clearance personnel. The human mind was not designed to sustain this level of continuous stress over extended periods. Most personnel broke down after 12 to 18 months. I had lasted nearly 2 years. That was actually above average. They asked if I wanted to continue tunnel operations. I said yes. They said my test results suggested that continuing would lead to complete breakdown within another 3 to 6 months. They could provide chemical intervention, compounds that would reduce the processing interference. But the compounds had side effects, reduced emotional range, increased aggression, difficulty forming new memories. I asked if the compounds would allow me to continue functioning. They said probably, for a time, until the underlying degradation progressed beyond the compound's capability to compensate. Then I would experience complete operational failure, potentially during an active engagement, which would endanger my squad. I asked what the alternative was. They said reassignment to less intensive operations, garrison duty, logistics support, training roles, functions that didn't require continuous high-stress processing. I said that was what happened to Davros. They confirmed, said he had experienced similar degradation. I was reassigned 4 weeks ago, was currently assigned to perimeter security duty on the Hive's 3rd level. Adequate performance in that role. No issues reported. They asked what I wanted. I sat in the evaluation room for a long time, couldn't form an answer. Finally said I didn't know. They said that was also common. Provided me 48 hours to decide. Returned me to temporary barracks. I spent those 48 hours attempting to process. What was my function now? If I couldn't perform clearance operations, what was I? The person I had been before the training no longer existed. The person I was during operations was failing. What remained? I didn't reach a conclusion. The medical team recalled me. Said time for decision had expired. Based on my test results and my inability to reach a decision, they were making the determination for me. Reassignment to garrison duty, effective immediately. They asked if I had questions. I asked if I could see Davros. They said contact with personnel from previous operational units was not prohibited, but was not encouraged. It often resulted in regression for both parties. But if I wanted to attempt contact, I could submit a request. I submitted the request. It was approved. I was given his location and a scheduled time for the meeting. 3 days later. The meeting occurred in a recreational area on the 3rd level, a large room with tables and chairs, perhaps 40 other personnel present. Davros was sitting at one of the tables, alone, staring at the table surface. I approached, sat across from him. He looked up, recognized me, said my designation. I confirmed, asked how he was functioning. He said adequately. The garrison duty was less intensive. He was adapting to the reduced operational tempo. I said I had been reassigned also. Same reasons. He said he had expected this. I had been showing degradation signs during our last operations together. He had tried to compensate by adjusting his positioning, but he had already been degrading himself. 2 degraded components couldn't compensate for each other. He asked if I was angry about the reassignment. I said I didn't know. Anger wasn't processed clearly. Everything was muted, like the medicated compounds had already been administered even though they hadn't. He said yes. That was accurate. The mind administered its own compounds when it couldn't sustain full processing anymore. Emotional dulling, memory suppression, protective mechanisms. They didn't fix the problem, but they prevented complete failure. We sat quietly for a while. Then I asked if he remembered the junction chamber, the one we visited before leaving Hive Praxis. He said yes. Every detail. That memory was still clear. Most memories from operations had degraded, but that one remained accessible. I asked why he thought we had gone there. He said it was an acknowledgement. The tunnels had taken things from us, changed us, made us into something we weren't before. Going back one final time was recognizing that transformation, accepting it, not fighting it anymore. He said he understood now that we had both been breaking for months before that. Maybe since Lasker died, maybe before. But we had continued performing functions because that was what we were trained to do. The breaking happened underneath the performance. Slowly, until performance became impossible. I asked if he felt it was over. He said no, not ended, changed, His function had changed. He wasn't the person who moved correctly in tunnels anymore. He was the person who stood at checkpoints and verified credentials. That was his function now. It was adequate. I asked if adequate was enough. He was quiet, then said it had to be. Because the alternative was complete cessation, and he wasn't ready for that yet, so adequate would function as sufficient. We sat there for the full scheduled meeting duration. 90 minutes. Didn't talk for most of it. Just existed in the same space. When the time ended, we both stood. He said maybe we would see each other again. Maybe not. But either way, he archived our shared operations. They remained accessible. They mattered in his personal record even if they didn't matter to the larger system. I said I had archived them also. He nodded. Then he left. I haven't seen him since. That was 4 years ago. I confirmed the duration in my logs. 4 years since reassignment. I've been performing garrison duty at various locations since then. Currently assigned to Hive Tertius, monitoring substructure access points. The tunnels are below me. I stand above them and prevent unauthorized access. Sometimes I hear sounds from below. Machinery, water flow, structural creaking, and sometimes I think I hear movement. Patterns that suggest something large displacing through confined spaces. I report these sounds. The reports are logged. No action is taken. The sounds continue. Other personnel are assigned to this posting. They rotate through on 4-month cycles. I have been here for 14 months. I don't know why my rotation period is extended. I don't ask. New clearance teams deploy periodically. I observe them during their surface staging. Young, functional. They move with certainty. They believe in their mission parameters. They will descend. They will clear tunnels. They will eliminate targets. Some will die. Some will be injured. Some will survive long enough to degrade like I did. The cycle continues. I archive all of this. The memories are still present. Lasker checking his weapon. Tarek burning. John bleeding out despite our intervention. Darvis moving correctly, then moving carefully, then not moving at all. The junction chamber. The device that responded to touch. The corpses were sealed in ancient tunnels. The large target that vocalized in structured patterns. All archived, all accessible, all unable to be integrated into the current function. I exist now as an observer. I perform minimal functions. Checkpoint duty, access verification. But primarily I observe. New teams descend. Time passes. The sounds continue below. The hive continues above. The Imperium continues in all directions, consuming everything, perpetuating itself through consumption. Davros was correct. We were fuel. The targets were fuel. The workers sealed in tunnels were fueled. All of it feeding the same mechanism. The mechanism doesn't care about the fuel's nature. It only requires that the fuel continues to arrive. I stand at this checkpoint and I verify credentials and I listen to the sounds below and I understand that I am waiting. Not for orders, not for reassignment, just waiting, existing in the space between what I was and what I will become. The transformation is not complete. I'm not yet archived to the point where observation ends, but I will be. Eventually. The darkness below is patient. It has existed longer than the Imperium. It will exist after. It consumes without hunger. It continues without purpose. We descend into it with weapons and fire, and we believe we are fighting something. but we are simply being consumed in a different pattern. The pattern continues. The pattern will always continue. I observe, I archive, I wait. This is a function now. This is what remains.